We are about to watch a video called, Are All Religions True? My personal answer, of course, would be no, they're not. None of them are true, actually. If you mean truth in terms of wisdom, yes, all religions have wisdom, so they're all true in that sense. But if you mean literally true, then no, none of them are correct. But I suspect that's not what we're about to hear at all. This video is by Cross-Examined. They are a Christian apologetics organization. Frank Turek does videos with them a lot. He may be involved with them in some other ways. I don't know. I don't really care. But he wrote a book called I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, which to me is about as perplexing of a book title as you can possibly get. After all, it doesn't really require much faith to say, you know, I'm not really sure God exists, and I'm not really sure I should believe in God. I don't think the evidence is that great. That's not a proposition that requires a lot of faith. But this video is pretty long, so let's check it out, let's get into it, and see what they have to say. Let's see if they can change our minds.
Can't all religions be true? Or can't all religions at least have some of the truth and none have all the truth? And this is quite often illustrated by the 6 blind men and the elephant. You ever heard this parable?
I gotta say, before he even gets into any of what he's about to say, 6 blind men and an elephant is a great way to explain how religion happened. A bunch of people with no idea how anything in the world worked, grasping at whatever explanations they possibly could to understand it, and failing miserably.
This is what professors often use to try and convince students that, you know, religions don't really have the truth. They kind of share the truth, but they're not really, one is not really more true than the other. They think they have the truth, but they really don't. And it's illustrated this way. There are 6 blind men, 6 blindfolded men, and one feels the ear of the elephant and thinks it's a fan. Another feels the side of the elephant and thinks it's a wall. Another grabs the tail and says, no, this is a rope. Another one grabs the leg and says, no, this is a tree. Another grabs the tusk and says, this is a spear. And another, of course, grabs the trunk and says, no, we've got a great snake here.
I gotta say, why are these men feeling up this poor elephant in the first place? But also, another thing I want to say is that I think we should rename every part of elephant anatomy according to this illustration. Elephants should definitely have fans, walls, ropes, trees, spears, and snakes. I think that would be awesome, and we should make that change as soon as possible. I am petitioning scientists all over the world about this as we speak.
Now, these 6 blind men are all supposed to represent the major world religions. They think they have the truth, but they don't really have the truth.
Correct.
They may have a piece of the truth, but they don't really have it.
Correct.
Now, how do you basically refute the conclusion that no religion is the truth?
Well, first of all, you bend yourself into some terrible, terrible pretzel-esque formations and just say whatever comes out of your mouth.
Here's the question to ask. What is the perspective of the parable teller? What is the perspective of the parable teller here?
Okay, not gonna lie, he's kind of got me a little bit fascinated. Let's hear this, because I mean the hooks are in, man. I'm into this now.
Can anyone tell me? Go ahead, loud. What? The parable teller can see everything. He can see the whole picture. The parable teller has an objective vantage point.
The parable teller is an atheist.
It's like our position. We're looking at it and we're going, you knuckleheads, that's an elephant, right? So once you have an objective position, you can really see the truth.
So is this supposed to be an elephant, or Judaism, Hinduism, Islam, Christianity, Taoism, and Buddhism? I'm very unclear. Please, Frank Turek, line me out here. I don't get it.
So what's the moral of the story? The moral of the story is, once I was blind, but now I see. What do I mean by that? Well, first of all, if you take off your blindfolds and see, you can see it's absolutely true that that is an elephant, that it's not a rope, that it's not a snake, that it's not a spear, a wall, or a tree, or any of those other things. It's an elephant. So truth is not relative to the individual, otherwise we wouldn't know the blind men were mistaken.
Truth is absolutely relative to the individual, and if you disagree, I would encourage you to go to like 5 different fundamentalist evangelical Christians, ask them the same set of like 5 or 6 questions, and watch them all give very different answers based on the Bible to their understanding. I guarantee you it'll happen. I've done this a number of times. It's every time.
We have an objective viewpoint, as the parable teller does, and we can see that the blind men were mistaken. Also, you can't know someone is wrong unless you know what is right. Let me state.
And you see, my fellow Christians, this is where we know we have the answers. We know we are correct and everybody else is wrong. See, these people think that atheists are really arrogant by saying there's probably no God because there's no evidence for it. But really, arrogance is just me saying, well, I'm right and you're all wrong. I don't have any evidence for it, but I'm pretty sure I'm right about everything. In this particular case, the person who is looking at the elephant could explain why all of the people in question are feeling the things they're feeling. Like, he could explain, like, well, okay, actually, this is what's called an elephant, and the elephant is comprised of these separate parts. You see, the elephant has a small, skinny tail. It has big, gigantic legs. It feels like a wall from the side because it's gigantic. It's got huge, odd ears, big tusks, and a trunk. It's a very bizarre-looking animal. You know that's right in this example because, yes, the audience here, we can see that. But here is a man assuming that, in fact, he is the only one who can really see the elephant. No, you are, in fact, one of the people groping in the blindness at the poor elephant. I am the one saying, please, stop feeling up the elephant, you weirdo.
State that another way. You can't know that someone is not right unless you know what is right. So for you to say that, no, that's not a fan, that's not a spear, that's not a rope, etc., you would have to know what it is, correct? So the bottom line to the whole thing is the pluralist believes everyone is blind but him. The pluralist is somebody who's saying, no, all religions lead up the mountain, they're all getting there, they don't have the truth, that they have...
I am not convinced this man entirely understands the parable himself, and if he does, he seems to be willfully misrepresenting exactly what the parable means. In this case, everybody but the parable teller is, in fact, blind. That is part of the story here. And I don't know how he's missing this. Is he doing it on purpose? I don't know. But I'm fascinated. Let's see where he goes with this.
Some of the truth, and you can't really know the truth, all that nonsense, okay? Why is the pluralist given an objective position, but we can't have that same objective position? If we take off our blindfolds, we can see the truth as well. You see what I'm saying here?
I think really the pluralist in this specific scenario is just saying that from the outside, you all look the same. Whereas this man is trying to say, well, you see, from the outside, I know I'm different. It's not exactly the same thing. It's just, it may sound very similar, but it's not exactly the same thing. I'm sorry, Frank. It's just not.
In other words, the parable, as many college professors tell it, actually proves exactly the opposite to the point they're trying to make. They're trying to say that nobody has the truth, when the rest of us are going, yoo-hoo, Mr. Professor, that's an elephant. And
I love how he tells a joke to the most receptive crowd he can possibly get, and it does not land at all. Brilliant work, Frank. Please don't try to become a comedian.
We can do the same thing when it comes to religion. If we take off our blindfolds, we can discover the truth. And that's what we try and do in apologetics. We try and discover the truth, which is giving evidence for what you believe.
See, now that is a very interesting definition of apologetics, because to me it seems as if apologetics is the act of grabbing a blindfold and putting it on yourself as hard as you can. The reason I say this is because apologetics have a certain number of themes to them. Okay, so I have this fundamentalist friend. I love her to death. She's a great person. She's been through some difficult stuff recently, and we talk a lot about life and all of that good stuff. But we're very different. Obviously, I'm an atheist, but she is a super fundamentalist, and I think even a young earth creationist. We have discussed Bible verses frequently and their meanings. We both have a very good knowledge of Bible verses and their meanings. And I like to point out little contradictions in the verses. And one time I wanted to illustrate a point to her. And she was about to go look up some apologetics arguments in favor of her understanding of a verse, as opposed to what the verse more obviously seemed to be saying in its actual words. And I said to her something like, I can already tell you exactly what these apologists are going to say about it. They're going to say, well, maybe it was a title. Maybe it wasn't an actual name, even though it's literally just a name. Maybe it was a title. Maybe it was an honorific, something like that. They're going to say, well, maybe it was an alternative name for the person. It was not. The person in question did not have any alternative names that we know of, and especially not this one that doesn't even describe this person. So I pointed out those two arguments and a couple more that I knew the apologists were going to say, without even looking. I had never looked at the apologetics arguments for this. I had just assumed correctly, might I add. I got all three correct. I made three guesses, and all three were the examples listed on the apologetics website. How good can your drive towards truth be if your explanations are so contrived and so shallow at the same time that an external observer can guess what you're going to say without even having to look it up, without even having heard of your organization before? Because I had never heard of this organization before. I had never looked at them, never seen them, nothing. But she looked it up, and she was amazed. Well, how'd you know that? And I was like, well, I've read these people's arguments any number of times, not these specific people, but I have read these arguments over and over. I know every trick in their rhetorical toolkit. And that's why I say it's more like putting a blindfold on repeatedly with gusto than taking one off. I'm sure Frank Turek would disagree, but he is the one handing out the blindfolds.
But sometimes you'll have somebody say this, look, come on, all religions teach basically the same thing. Have you heard that? Don't they all teach basically the same thing? Come on, they all teach you ought to love one another. That's basically it. Is that true? No, actually, it's not true.
He is wrong, of course. I don't know how much he's read about other religions, but every religion that I have studied any amount into has exhortations against violence, even though those religions very often include exhortations to violence earlier on. But it does seem like that you can find whatever tendency you're looking for within any specific religion.
There's a kernel of truth to it, that most religions do have a moral code, and quite frequently a relatively common moral code, but not all religions teach that you ought to love one another. Certainly Satanism doesn't, right?
Actually, it does. You're wrong, Frank. Sorry.
Certainly what I would call Orthodox Islam doesn't. People who follow the Quran and the teachings and life of Muhammad.
We are getting into some very contentious territory here. Of course he would say something like this. And to a certain extent, I would agree. But I think a lot of the violence that we now attribute to radical Islam actually is the result of geopolitical conditions and not necessarily anything actually in the religion, or else there wouldn't be peaceful Muslims. And there are. If a religion were based solely on the impulse to violence, it probably wouldn't be a very successful religion. That's just how it is. Religion binds communities together mostly for positive values, but the geopolitical conditions of the Middle East and countries in Africa has been really rough, obviously. That goes without saying. That kind of thing breeds extremism. Think about the Crusades. Think about the Inquisitions. Christians can't just wash their hands of these things because they were a long time ago. Those things also spread from Christianity, from the words of Jesus, the peacemaker, that guy. So I think it's very ironic to sort of call out Islam specifically and just sort of wave off all of the things in Christian history that are very similar and resulted from similar geopolitical conditions. But I digress.
Because if you look at the Quran and you look at the life and teachings of Muhammad, what the terrorists are doing, they're doing as a result of studying the Quran and the life and teachings of Muhammad.
Not necessarily. Again, geopolitical conditions play a huge role. You can think a lot of things about Muhammad. It's true, there are some very questionable things to say the least. I don't really want to say more than that for a number of reasons. I'm not really here to talk about Islam currently. I probably will at some point, but this is not the video for that. But I must say that I find this take very disingenuous. Muhammad was living in very different conditions than Jesus was. And the irony is that in some ways, Muhammad lived out the expectations of Messiah better than Jesus did, in terms of freeing his people from oppressors and all that good stuff. So really, in some sense, I tend to agree and disagree with that sort of take. But that's a very nuanced issue for another day. But I think that just saying Muhammad was violent or bad and therefore all of his followers must be also is very disingenuous. It's as disingenuous as saying Jesus was good, therefore his followers must be also. People are complicated. They take many different things from all kinds of stories. You can't just put people in a box that's that simple. You just can't do that. It doesn't work. It's not reality.
So that's not love your neighbor, as we are all now too well aware. But actually, there's a question you should always ask people. In fact, there are 3 questions you should always ask people when they come up with a statement about religion like this. Actually, you can use these 3 questions for virtually anything. Here's the first question you ought to ask somebody who says something like this. The question is, what do you mean by that?
Yeah, that is a good question to ask. And in fact, if I were talking to Frank Turek, I suspect I would be asking him that question a whole lot.
What do you mean all religions teach basically the same thing? And see what they say. What do you mean by that? Why is that a good question? Because this right here is known as a slogan.
Boy, good thing Christianity doesn't have any of those.
Isn't it? It's a common cultural saying, and few people stop to think about what it means. And if you ask them, what do you mean by that? Many of them will go,
I wonder if this guy has ever really talked to Christians before about like serious stuff, because I guarantee you, if he did, he would know that this is a very frequent reaction among the average Christian if you ask them almost anything about the Bible, which like none of them have ever read.
Or the second question after that is, how did you come to that conclusion? And you could make that a little bit more specific to this statement by saying, how did you come to that conclusion? Have you studied world religions for yourself?
How did you come to that conclusion, Frank Turek? Were you born into Christianity, maybe? Were you born into a culture and society that values Christianity as its main religion? Is that a thing that could have happened, Frank? Is that how you got in this position, my dude?
What are most people going to say at that point? No, they're not going to. They're probably not going to have studied that, right? You can use these 2 questions with about anything you hear in religion or in virtually any other topic. Because you will find that most people in our culture today have a worldview built on slogans.
This is really a pot versus kettle moment for him, but actually he is completely correct on this one. Surprisingly enough, it has taken this long, but I finally found something we can agree on. Good work, Frank. You finally did it. I've waited so long for this moment, my dude. I have waited so long.
Maybe not most, but a good number of people. They hear slogans like this and they take that. They hear another slogan. The Bible's been changed throughout the centuries. They take that.
Correct. It has, frequently. And in fact, as I've pointed out in other videos, fundamentalists like him would probably hate it if they found out that the modern biblical canon is largely the result of the church that would become the Roman Catholic Church, which they do not like a whole lot.
The Bible was written long after Jesus. They take that. Evolution.
Well, that is correct. The Bible was written long after Jesus. The first writings we have from the New Testament specifically are Paul's writings, and those were started a few years after Jesus' death. And the New Testament Gospels, they were all written anywhere from like 30 to 50 years later. I mean, they were based on oral traditions, but they were written decades later. And poorly sourced, poorly attributed. Like, a lot of the stories were probably just straight up made up. A lot of things were just about what the author wanted an audience to understand. If you'll notice, over the course of the Gospels, Mark was the first, John was the last to be written. The blame is gradually shifted for the death of Jesus from the from the Romans to the Jews. And that's a very intentional thing, because it turned out that Gentiles were very into Christianity, a lot more than Jewish people had been early on in Christian history. And so, naturally, it made a lot of sense for the writers of the later Gospels, who may have been Gentiles themselves, to sort of downplay the Roman involvement in Jesus' death and shift that blame over to the Jews, who have always been, as we all know, a very convenient scapegoat.
It's true, they take that, and they put all of these slogans together, and they go, this is my worldview, never realizing any of the evidence behind any of those slogans, any of the real particulars behind any of those slogans.
Again, this is really ironic because, actually, I may have not called it ironic before, but this is really ironic because he mentioned evolution being true, and evolution is true. It's a fact. There's mountains of evidence for it. Evolution is about as well attested as anything in this universe can be. So it's odd that he would lump that up with certain other things and just sort of imply that there is no evidence. No, it's not that there isn't no evidence. It's that you have either never seen it or don't accept it. But it is there, and you are wrong about evolution. Sorry. Actually, I'm not sorry at all. It sucks for you, though.
Slogans, and they go skipping through life thinking, I really know what's going on. As soon as you question them on it, though, they run short of intellectual justification for the slogan in about 3 seconds. Somebody says, you ought not believe the Bible because it's been changed throughout the centuries. You say, how did you come to that conclusion?
I gotta say, I do like the faces he keeps making when saying these things. I do not think the fact that the Bible was changed over the centuries is in itself a good reason to not believe the Bible. It may be a good reason to look at it with more scrutiny and question more things within it, but I'm not sure that alone rises to the level of, therefore, I don't believe any of it. I certainly believe that a number of things mentioned in the Old Testament and New Testament happened. Jesus was almost certainly a real person. The question is, did he perform all these miraculous acts? Well, no. Did he come back from the dead? Well, no. People don't do that. So I think that's very disingenuous, but that is the kind of thing that Christian apologists say that atheists would say, because they don't understand us or what we think, and they assume that we therefore must just be intellectually lazy or something along those lines.
Have you studied the manuscript evidence for yourself? You're not being mean here. You're just trying to find out where people are coming from. And every once in a while, you might find somebody who thinks they've studied it and has the truth. Okay? But ask those 2 questions. What do you mean by that? How did you come to that conclusion? By the way, the third question is this. The third question is, have you ever considered? And then you can add what you want to add after that. Have you ever...
Frank, have you ever considered you may be wrong about all of this? Have you ever considered that you yourself are terribly mistaken about everything you believe in, and that you have built up a house of cards to protect what is, in reality, a notoriously fragile belief system that is completely collapsing in the West? Have you? Have you, Frank? Be honest.
Considered this book, for example? Like, I don't have enough faith to be an atheist. Or have you considered Mere Christianity, a great book on the Christian faith, particularly the moral argument? Or have you ever considered Evidence Demands a Verdict? Have you ever considered, Tim Keller's Reason for God? There's some good books out there. Or have you ever considered this argument? If you ask it in that way, it's not as offensive.
These books that he has mentioned seem to really only be effective when it comes to people who already believe in Christianity. These books are not known for converting mass numbers of atheists to Christianity. In fact, it seems like the only people who are converted are people who really never seem to understand why they were atheists in the first place. Lee Strobel is a great example of this. He wrote The Case for Christ, but I find it hard to believe that this guy was ever an atheist because he doesn't seem to have the faintest idea of what it actually means to be an atheist. He seems more like somebody who maybe left Christianity, got away from it, and just lived in the world for a while, then came back home to Jesus. As is frequently the case, it happens. But his idea of atheism seems more than a little bit suspicious. It does not pass the smell test. But I've heard any number of Christians tell me what a great book it is, and I have read it. It's terrible. It's pointless. It's complete garbage. It's not convincing at all. If you are an atheist from a reason or logic perspective, you will see right through it immediately. And I think that's pretty unfortunate because people don't realize. I think a lot of Christians read books like this and think they're getting something profound out of it. But if they would read some of our books, they would find out where they are terribly mistaken. There isn't much left of this clip. Let's see if he has anything else to say.
You don't have to refute. Here's the thing I'm trying to say. You don't have the obligation to refute what somebody else says.
Well, that's correct, I guess. But doesn't that defeat the entire point of talking to people about these things, doesn't it?
They have the burden of proof to support what they've just said.
Bro, what? You know, again, finally I can say again and mean it this time, but again, extremely ironic. This man has the burden of proof for the whole of Christianity, and yet he acts like the burden of proof falls on everybody else. It does not. You have to prove your case, and you have only proven your case to other people who think like you. I'm sorry to say, your mission has been staggeringly unsuccessful. There's a reason why you mainly speak to audiences of Christians, fundamentalists, people who already agree with you. It's because your arguments are not compelling to atheists and non-theists. Now, I would assume that there probably are a few out there who just don't know a lot about a lot. Oh, oops. Anyway, I would assume there are some out there who just don't know a lot about a lot and maybe go with it. But in general, these arguments are not compelling, and nobody's going to find them all that compelling. This video was not great, and I do not find really much worth responding to in it. It's mostly fun to make fun of. Frank Turek, I think, is a very low-quality apologist. He is certainly no William Lane Craig, who I also don't have a terribly high opinion of. And I sort of want to watch more videos of his just because they're kind of amusing, like to respond to. But as far as serious arguments for Christianity goes, you don't want to go to Frank Turek. I'm sorry to say. If you are a Christian watching this, pick somebody better. If you are one of the 2 or 3 people who made it all the way to the end of this video, thank you very much. I hope you liked it. And if you did, leave a like, leave a comment, subscribe so we can grow this channel together with the power of friendship. And thanks.